With us this morning, a guy who deals in the law all the time. He is Dave Sunday, the district attorney here of York County, and he joins us as he does every Wednesday morning here on WSBA. Good morning, Dave. How are you?
I'm doing great, Gary. Good morning. How are you this morning?
I'm doing very well. I wanted to ask you about this case that we've been talking about this morning in Altoona area, where this gymnasium, I think it's called Gorilla Gym, if I'm not mistaken, decided after Friday when they found out that the 24 counties that are open, theirs was not one of them in Blair County. And the guy and his wife decided to reopen the gym. And it was interesting because they were cited one Friday afternoon by the Altoona Code Enforcement and one on Saturday by the Altoona Police. But they said, no one allowed us to do this, but enough is enough. And one of the things that the Blair County District Attorney, Pete Weeks, who I'm sure you probably know, said, I'm not sure noncompliance with the governor's order is a crime. Criminalizing that behavior without legislation sounds unconstitutional. And yet, as we pointed out to our listeners the other day, the emergency powers of the governor, as he reads them, says that his decisions carry the weight of legislation. So let's say you're the district attorney here in this area, and people decide to open a business, and, what do you do from the law enforcement standpoint, from the general standpoint of carrying out what the governor says to do, and you're a guy who's sworn to help do that, right?
Yeah, that's correct, Gary, and I appreciate the question, and I always appreciate the very important public discourse that occurs on the show, and I think it's important, and I know you know that, and I know your listeners know that. I want to start with, we are, as you know, and as we've talked about, and as the whole world knows, in unprecedented times. Just last week, there was a memorandum that was provided from the Attorney General of the United States, Attorney Barr, to all of the assistant or all of the U.S. attorneys throughout the country. Like previously, we had U.S. Attorney Dave Freed on your show with me.
Right.
And so there's a Dave Freed in every federal judicial district throughout the country. And the memo outlined the critical nature of balancing public safety with the preservation of civil rights. And I want to come back to that. When I'm asked a question like the one you just asked me about what would I do in a specific situation, I think it's important to sort of unpack the different duties and needs at play at that moment. And what I mean by that is you have broader, larger civil rights issues that are obviously incredibly important to every single one of us. And there is a method and a path to deal with those in the instance that they're being violated. That is occurring, if it's warranted, through the United States Attorney's offices, because through their Federal Civil Rights Division, that's something that they can deal with. And that's something that in this memo that just came out last week, it's directing them to look for this. He's directing their federal prosecutors to prioritize cases against those seeking to illegally profit from the pandemic, but he's taking it a step further, and what he's doing is he's basically saying that, as the Department of Justice recently explained in guidance to states and localities, that even in times of an emergency, when reasonable and temporary restrictions are placed on rights, the First Amendment and federal statutory law prohibit discrimination against religious institutions and religious believers.
Right.
The restrictions on state and local authority are not limited just to religious institutions and believers. For example, the Constitution forbids in certain circumstances, Gary, discrimination against disfavored speech and undue interference with the national economy. And so with that being said, and this is important to understand this backdrop, with AG Barr instructing the U.S. attorneys to the following: if a state or local ordinance crosses the line from an appropriate exercise of authority to stop the spread of COVID-19 into an overbearing infringement of constitutional and statutory protections, the Department of Justice may have an obligation to address that overreach in federal court. And so that's part one, because a lot of people, Gary, I get emails and phone calls about that specific topic. And it's important for people to understand that the Attorney General has directed his U.S. attorneys to be aware, be on the lookout, and to be ready for that. I spoke with U.S. Attorney Dave Freed for the Middle District of Pennsylvania, and I believe they set up a hotline, in fact, where people can call, they can have, file complaints. And so I wanted to make sure that your listeners were aware of that part of this, okay? Do you have any questions on that sort of before I move on?
Yeah, so as I listen to that then, what I hear, and again, I don't want to put words in your mouth, and I want to make sure I'm hearing it correctly. So I'm hearing that, the Constitution trumps everything. In other words, as you look at the direction from the Attorney General Barr, he's basically saying, okay, governors are making these rules, and yet at the same time, if the governor or if some other legal local branch or so forth, kind of oversteps their bounds, you have a responsibility or at least a right to challenge that. Am I hearing that correctly? Am I saying that correctly?
No, you said that right on, Gary. That's spot on. And he actually went a step further. He directed the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights to oversee and coordinate their efforts to monitor state and local policies, and if necessary, Gary, to take action to correct them. And so I think that's something that the citizens need to hear and know, that the most powerful force for law enforcement in this nation, our United States Attorney General, has provided that guidance to all of his United States attorneys.
As you understand it, and go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
As you understand it, the governor's power comes from emergency powers that normally we think about during natural disasters, a flood or a hurricane or something like that. And this has kind of been grouped in with that, and that his directives take on as I read it the other day, and this was from the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, that it takes on the same power and weight as legislation. Is that what you understand so far on this, Dave, about a minute to go in this segment?
Not necessarily, Gary. I think that so there's many different ways in which so to start with, what you said about the fact that it's derived from statute that was put in effect, I think, a little over 60 or 70 years ago to deal with certain emergencies that occur in society. Like you said, floods, terrible pandemic, things of that nature. And so that is where this all comes from. Okay. Now, turning to whether or not it's the law, it certainly is the law, but it is different than the crimes code, which was enacted by legislators. And the reason I say that is, and are we at the end of our time here, Gary?
Dave Sunday, our District Attorney of York County, here on WSBA Morning News with Gary Sutton. WSBA Morning News with Gary.